In the dark, freezing December of 1940, it genuinely felt like Western civilization was living hour to hour. The Battle of Britain had been won in the skies, but the Blitz was still tearing through the streets. London was burning. The Luftwaffe was pounding industrial cities like Coventry and Liverpool, and every night the question wasn't, will it happen again, but how bad will it be this time? On the map, the British Empire still looked enormous, a huge splash of pink across the globe. But inside the war rooms of Whitehall, the people running the country knew something they could not say to the public. Britain wasn't only bleeding soldiers. It was bleeding money. Fast. The empire that had once financed the world was reaching the point where it couldn't finance its own survival. Winston Churchill, the man whose voice made people stand a little straighter, sat down in the underground cabinet war rooms to write one of the most important letters of his life. It was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States. Churchill was a master of language, the kind of person who could turn a sentence into a weapon. But in this letter, the problem wasn't rhetoric. The problem was reality. He had to tell the leader of the world's richest neutral nation that Great Britain was running out of cash. The letter laid out the strategic situation, the U-boat peril in the Atlantic, and the desperate need for destroyers and aircraft. But the sharpest point was financial. Churchill warned that the moment was approaching when the British Treasury would no longer be able to pay cash for the supplies Britain needed to keep fighting. The British people would fight on beaches and landing grounds, yes, but they couldn't fight without ammunition. And they could no longer afford to buy it. It was a plea for survival, and whether you call it insolvency or standing on the edge of a cliff, the meaning was the same. To understand how the wealthiest empire in history reached that point, you have to look at the brutal economics of total war. When the war began in September 1939, Britain still had real financial muscle. There were gold reserves, there were overseas investments. British citizens and companies owned railroads in Argentina, mines in Chile, and major industrial stakes abroad. London remained one of the central nerves of global finance, shipping, and insurance. But Hitler's war was different from anything Britain was used to. This wasn't just men and rifles. It was a war of machines. It consumed steel, oil, aluminum, rubber, everything, at a pace that smashed pre-war assumptions. And here's the uncomfortable part for Britain. It had to import a huge share of what it needed. As Europe closed and sea routes became battlefields, Britain's lifeline stretched across the Atlantic to the U.S. At this stage, the United States was officially neutral. The American public was deeply isolationist. They remembered the First World War and were determined not to be dragged into another European catastrophe. Congress had passed neutrality acts designed to keep America out, and inside those laws sat a clause that mattered more than speeches: cash and carry. Britain could buy American supplies, but only if it paid immediately in cash, and only if it carried the goods away on its own ships. No loans, no credit. Pay first, ship later. And if that rule sounds reasonable on paper, wait until you hear what it did to Britain's last dollars. For roughly the first year, Britain met those rules by draining itself. Gold reserves were liquidated. Dollars vanished. In a secret effort to protect and mobilize national wealth, the British government moved gold and securities overseas, part of what is often associated with Operation Fish, so that it could keep paying American suppliers. It was an extraordinary movement of physical wealth under wartime risk, and for a time, it worked. But by late 1940, reality caught up. Gold stocks were badly depleted. Liquid cash was almost gone. British purchasing offices in Washington found themselves staring at contracts they could not sign, because London was warning that there simply were not enough dollars left to honor them. When Roosevelt read Churchill's letter, he understood the stakes immediately. If Britain fell, the strategic position of the United States would deteriorate rapidly. But Roosevelt also faced a political trap at home. He could not simply give Britain money. American law forbade it, and public opinion would punish it. He needed a way to help Britain that looked like strategy, not charity, something he could defend to Congress and taxpayers. That is where the idea of Lend-Lease was born. Publicly, Roosevelt explained it with a calm, almost folksy analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't argue about the price of the garden hose. You lend him the hose, and you sort it out later. It sounded generous. It sounded simple. But behind closed doors, the negotiation was anything but neighborly. From the American side, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. played a central role. He wanted Britain to defeat Hitler, but he also believed the American taxpayer had to be protected. His position was blunt. Before the United States committed massive resources, Britain had to prove it had exhausted its own. Morgenthau demanded a sweeping picture of Britain's finances and overseas assets. The British negotiators were stunned by the tone. They were being asked to open their books to a foreign power, not as equals, but as a nation in financial distress. The British argued that they had already sold gold, and that dumping long-term investments during a war would be a fire sale. They warned that stripping overseas income would leave Britain economically hollow after victory, unable to import food or rebuild its cities. Morgenthau remained unmoved. His logic was harsh but clear. If Britain still owned valuable assets, why should American taxpayers cover Britain's bills? Why should an Iowa farmer pay for weapons if profitable British-owned companies in the United States were still generating income? One painful symbol of this pressure was the American Viscose Corporation, a major rayon producer in the United States tied to British ownership interests through Courtaulds. Under intense pressure, Britain moved to sell. The circumstances meant buyers knew Britain had no choice, and the sale reflected that imbalance. The episode later appeared in British parliamentary records, underscoring how deeply wartime finance had forced the liquidation of overseas assets. Whatever the exact valuation debates, the dynamic was unmistakable. Britain was being pushed to convert its future income into immediate survival. This pressure wasn't just economic, it was political. Roosevelt needed to shepherd Lend-Lease through a hostile Congress. Isolationists claimed Britain was richer than it admitted and was trying to trick America into paying its bills. Visible asset sales became proof points, evidence that Britain really was scraping the bottom of the barrel. And the liquidation didn't stop with companies and securities. It reached geopolitics itself. Britain was desperate for destroyers, as German U-boats sank merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Churchill asked Roosevelt for 50 older American destroyers. Roosevelt agreed, but again, not for free. In exchange, the United States received long-term base rights on British territory across the Atlantic, from Newfoundland to the Caribbean. For Britain, it meant immediate protection. For the United States, it meant a strategic footprint that would last generations. By the time the Lend-Lease Act became law in March 1941, Britain was operating on the edge. Gold was gone. Dollar liquidity was thin. The war economy consumed everything it produced. Publicly, Lend-Lease was celebrated as the arsenal of democracy, and in practical terms, it saved Britain. It delivered food, fuel, aircraft, vehicles, and raw materials without which Britain might have collapsed. But Lend-Lease was not just about supply. It also pointed toward the shape of the post-war world. Embedded in the agreements was a commitment most famously associated with Article 7 to move toward reduced discriminatory trade practices after the war. That mattered because Britain relied on imperial preference, a system of tariffs that favored trade within the empire. Article 7 didn't abolish that system overnight, but it pushed Britain toward a future where protected imperial trade blocs would be harder to sustain. As the war continued and the United States formally entered after Pearl Harbor, the alliance became military as well as economic. American troops poured into Britain. The island became a giant base for Allied air power. But the economic gap only widened. American industry expanded at staggering speed, producing for war while still supplying global markets. Britain, meanwhile, converted nearly everything to war production. Exports shrank, long-held commercial markets weakened, and into those gaps stepped American firms. By 1944, the shift was obvious. Financial gravity had moved across the Atlantic. The United States was accumulating reserves, industrial capacity, and leverage on a scale Britain could no longer match. Then came victory. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. In London, crowds filled the streets, bonfires burned, strangers embraced. After years of fear and sacrifice, the relief was real and overwhelming. But in Washington, there was little sentimentality, because the wartime machine had a switch. And once the war ended, it flipped. Within days, President Harry Truman moved to terminate Lend-Lease. This is the moment most people miss. The shooting stopped, but the financial war didn't. The cutoff was sudden and absolute. Supply chains built around wartime assumptions were disrupted almost overnight. Britain's economy, shaped entirely around fighting the war, now faced peace without the financial scaffolding it relied on. John Maynard Keynes looked at the numbers and saw disaster. Britain imported a huge share of its food and raw materials. During the war, those imports had been financed through extraordinary arrangements. Without them, Britain faced immediate crisis. So Britain returned to Washington, not as a triumphant ally, but as a nation trying to avoid collapse. In late 1945, Keynes traveled to the United States, exhausted and in failing health, carrying both economic calculations and a moral argument. Britain, he believed, deserved generosity, a grant, recognition of the years it had stood alone. But the post-war American mood had hardened. The public was tired of paying for Europe, and Congress was deeply suspicious of Britain's new Labour government. The result was the Anglo-American Loan of 1946. It was not a gift. It was a commercial loan with interest and conditions. One condition in particular would prove devastating: sterling convertibility. Britain was required to make the pound convertible into dollars. On paper, it sounded like free trade. In reality, it risked a run on Britain's reserves. Keynes warned that if the window opened, the world would rush to exchange pounds for dollars, because everyone wanted American goods. Britain accepted the terms because the alternative was worse. In 1947, convertibility was introduced, And exactly what Keynes feared happened. Sterling was dumped. Reserves drained rapidly. Within weeks, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility. The humiliation was complete, but the message was clear. Britain was no longer the financial anchor of the world. That weakness carried geopolitical consequences. In early 1947, Britain informed the United States that it could no longer afford major commitments in places like Greece and Turkey. It wasn't ideology, it was money. The United States stepped in, and the Truman Doctrine followed. Power, in the modern world, doesn't only move through armies. It moves through budgets. The struggle continued. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound, a blunt admission that its pre-war economic position was gone. And the bill for survival did not end there. The debt from the 1946 loan stretched across generations. The final payment was made in December 2006, 6 decades after the war ended. But this is the real price of victory. Germany lost and was destroyed. Britain won and was exhausted. The United States emerged with its industry intact, its reserves massive, and its leverage unmatched. This isn't a simple story of villains and victims. The United States had real strategic reasons to act as it did, and real political constraints at home. But economics was always at the table. When Churchill wrote to Roosevelt in December 1940, he helped save Britain from Hitler. But he also crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Britain traded long-term strength for short-term survival. It was a deal made under bombs, submarines, and empty vaults. And it worked. Britain survived, but the cost lasted for decades. And that's the moment the ledger outvotes the ideology. Chrono finance, following the money through time,